200 to 209 AD, the Severan Dynasty. Welcome back to a new century of 202 decades. When it looked like chaos would consume Rome, Septimius Severus stabilized the empire, following the corrupt reign of Commodus and the fractious fighting of the five emperors. But many of his fixes just kicked the instability down the road, creating bigger problems for future generations. This time, the conquering emperor comes up against the challenges of running the state. We will see the legal reforms he set in motion, which still impact modern theory of law. We'll get to know his family and follow along as they take a feuding expedition to the edge of the empire. But first, a short recap. Last decade, a lot happened. Commodus, the last of the Antonine dynasty, was assassinated after a decade of corrupt and inattentive rule. He was succeeded by Pertinax, a distinguished senator who tried to rein in the excesses of the previous regime. But it was too much too fast. Pertinax upset the Praetorian Guard and was murdered. The Praetorians, seeing their own power, auctioned the emperorship off to the highest bidder. The ill-fated winner was Julianus. Unfortunately for him, winning over the Praetorians like this meant losing the backing of everyone else: the people of Rome, the Senate, and the legions in the field. Immediately, 3 governors expressed their intent to free the capital of this illegitimate emperor. Severus was the closest to Rome. As he set off from his base in Pannonia, he made a deal with the second governor, Albinus of Britannia, to become his Caesar, his second in command and successor. With a smaller army and a farther route to Italy, Albinus agreed. One challenger for Severus neutralized. The other challenger was Pescennius Niger of Syria. And, of course, Julianus, the sitting emperor, still had to be plucked out of the capital. Severus and his army descended on Rome. Julianus tried and failed to deter him. Julianus was killed before Severus entered the city. After being proclaimed emperor, Severus quickly left for the east. In a series of battles, his army overcame Niger and the Syrians. Shortly after eliminating this rival, he betrayed Albinus and named his own son as his heir. Albinus mobilized his army in response. Severus and Albinus met in the largest battle of Roman history outside of Lugdunum in Gaul. The Senate preferred Albinus, but Severus was victorious on the battlefield. He briefly returned to Rome and purged the supporters of Albinus, then just as quickly left again for the east. There he campaigned against the Parthians, advancing deep into their territory and even sacking their capital, Ctesiphon. After multiple failed attempts at capturing the desert fortress of Hatra, Severus ended the campaign. His expansions had to end there. As this new century dawns, we meet Severus in Antioch. Here's what we're covering this time. Part 1, Rome Alone. Part 2, Legally Dawned. Part 3, Meet the Severans. And Part 4, Family Vacation. Part 1, Rome Alone. Wait a minute, you might be saying. Didn't you just end the last episode with Severus in Alexandria? And now he's beginning this decade in Antioch? Well, looks like I jumped the gun a bit on my chronology last time. Yes, Severus, after failing to take Hatra, wrapped up his Parthian campaign, crossed over the Euphrates, and made for the coast. This brought him to Antioch. His bested rival, Niger, had been based out of the city when Commodus died. Many in the city of Antioch would have felt antipathy toward Severus, so it was worthwhile to spend some time here. We don't have any records of his stay, but surely he rewarded his supporters and punished those who had been a little too eager in their backing of Niger. His stay wasn't long. Severus soon left, going south along the Levantine coast. His entourage passed through the province of Palestine, which was apparently in a state of some unrest. We don't know exactly why. Our more contemporary sources are silent on this. But Eusebius, writing over a century later, mentions some small Jewish insurrections. These were minor, small enough to be passed over by Cassius Dio's history. The only thing else we have from this time here is from the spurious Historia Augusta, which states that he forbade conversions to Judaism or to Christianity. If true, it's noteworthy that he distinguished the two sects, something an emperor a century prior probably wouldn't have done. Leaving Palestine, Severus reached Egypt and came to Alexandria at last. As another reminder, Alexandria was the second city of the empire in size and importance, only behind Rome. It was a cosmopolitan city. Greeks were probably the largest ethnicity in the city, followed by Jews and then Egyptians, and then a whole host of other ethnos from the empire and from beyond. Alexandria was simultaneously the gateway to Egypt and to the east for the Roman Empire. Thanks to the Red Sea trading routes, spices, jewels, slaves, animals, and every other wonder of India and beyond passed through Alexandria on their way to distant Roman shores. As Severus approached the city, he was greeted by an archway with an inscription saying, "To the Lord Niger." Naturally, the emperor was angered by this dishonor. Alexandria had sided with his rival Niger during the civil war of the last decade, and this was an unflattering reminder. Someone must have been facepalming in the background about forgetting to scratch that inscription out. When Severus confronted the Alexandrians about the words honoring Niger, a quick thinker of the group offered that what it actually meant wasn't to Lord Niger, but to the Lord of Niger. Made up or not, this quip was enough to satisfy the emperor's pride. Two more actions of Severus in Alexandria are noteworthy. First was his closing of the tomb of Alexander the Great. The great conqueror's tomb was here in his eponymous city, and his body was still visible, exquisitely embalmed in the Egyptian style. Severus came to see Alexander. After looking upon the dead Macedonian and reading from the sacred books kept in the tomb, Severus had the entrance sealed off. He wanted to be the last to see the great conqueror. Severus was always superstitious, trusting in signs, omens, prophecy, and astrology. Perhaps he felt closing Alexander's tomb would prevent another from capturing his genius. Second, in Alexandria, Severus gave the city its own local city council. Up to this point, the city had relied solely on representatives of the emperor for administration. Since Augustus's conquest, Egypt had always been treated as a personal domain of the emperor. But just like with his policy toward Italy being brought down from its special status into something more like a normal province, Severus here is lifting Egypt up from its special status to become more like a normal province. He was a leveler. Severus also intervened and changed many of the city's laws. We'll see him do similar legal reforms on an empire-wide scale later this episode. Leaving Alexandria, Septimius and his entourage set sail up the Nile, much like Hadrian had done on his tour of the empire 7 decades earlier. The flotilla stopped at the cities of Memphis and Thebes, and while our sources don't specifically mention it, I'm willing to bet they also made a pit stop at Antinopolis, and someone in the party paid respects to the deified lover of Hadrian. Further south, they made a stop at the statue of Memnon. For a description of this site, check out the episode on the 130s. Severus visited the statue alone, and he did hear it sing. Out of respect for the god, he had the statue restored. Unfortunately for posterity, this project, meant to improve the statue, ruined it. After the reconstruction, the statue never sang again. Add that to the list of great sites in Egypt Severus destroyed. Severus had now checked off the essentials of any Egyptian vacation. As the Historia Augusta puts it, he had taken part in the worship of the god Serapis, had learned something of antiquity, and had seen unfamiliar animals in strange places. For he visited Memphis, Memnon, the pyramids, and the labyrinth, and examined them all with great care. It's fascinating to think that even the Romans, 2 millennia ago, had a sense of the ancient when it came to Egypt. Severus had explored the past in Egypt, but he would have to go further south to explore the unknown. From Memnon, the flotilla continued up the Nile for several days, maybe with the goal of finding the headwaters of the Nile. Romans had searched for them before and found nothing before having to turn back. Perhaps the emperor, with his large entourage, would have more success. But just as they reached the border with the kingdom of Aksum, an outbreak of smallpox afflicted the party. Severus himself fell ill. With this advance checked by nature, Severus heeded the omen and turned back north. He spent the next few months ruling from Alexandria. Sometime in late 201, Severus and his family boarded ships and set sail back toward Rome. Lest you think this would be a simple jump straight northwest across the sea to Italy, no. The winds and currents compelled ships of this era to almost always take a safer route. Instead, they sailed counterclockwise around the shores of the eastern Mediterranean and docked at Seleucia Pieria, the port of Antioch. They wintered in the city. With the new year, celebrations were held for Severus's third consulship, one that he shared with his son Caracalla, who was now 14 years old and officially made a co-emperor with his father. When spring came, the Severan family traveled by sea or by land to Thrace and then passed through Moesia. By March, they reached the large city of Sirmium in Lower Pannonia. Severus, as a former governor of Upper Pannonia, would have been well familiar with the area. He inspected the Pannonian legionary camps in his short stay. Moving on, he crossed into Italy, came to Aquileia, and reached Rome in May of 202. The return of the victorious emperor was a time for celebration. Festivities were held throughout the city in his honor, not just for the success of his Parthian campaign, but because 202 marked his 10th year as emperor. It doesn't feel like 10 years had passed since Severus unseated Julianus, but time flies when you're busy warring across the known world. 10 years as emperor, but had he spent even 10 months in Rome since 192? A triumph was offered to Severus, but he declined the honor. Rumors are that it was due to a flare-up of his gout. He was not a young man anymore. But the celebrations went along in the capital for over a month anyway. First, there was the celebration of his return, and in June came the Decinalia, an every 10-year festival of games, music, and theater. Of course, Severus lavished his citizens and his soldiers with gifts and entertainment. All of his soldiers received a reward of 10 gold coins, one for each year of their loyalty to him. Chariot racing, gladiatorial fights, and animal hunts were ordered. Times were good in Rome. If this was what living in a military dictatorship was like, few felt the need to complain. Construction soon began on a new arch in the northeast corner of the Forum, the Arch of Septimius Severus. This massive stone triumphal archway features reliefs of the defeat and submission of the Parthians to the Roman emperor. Engraved at the top are the words, "The Republic was restored, and the empire of the Roman people was spread by their remarkable virtues at home and abroad." Severus now settled in to his role as emperor. The warring was done. Now it was time to rule. For the next 6 years, Severus would only briefly leave the capital. During that interval, the spotlight fades out on Severus and begins to shine brightly on his family, his Praetorian prefect, and his jurists. But before the focus fully moves away from the emperor, let me mention a few important notes for those 6 years. We've already touched on the Arch of Severus in the Forum, but 2 other large buildings ordered by Severus left their mark on Rome. The first was the Septimius. This was a large marble facade and fountains meant to impress those coming into the city by the Appian Way. The structure was located along the base of the Palatine Hill. While not a temple, it was dedicated to the 7 zones or the 7 planetary deities of classical astronomy: the Moon, the Sun, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Also begun near the end of Septimius' reign were the Baths of Severus. Well, that's what they would have been called if they had been completed sooner. Today they're called the Baths of Caracalla. We could get into this monument still standing impressively in Rome next decade, but I wanted to mention that Severus initiated it to show that his focus wasn't entirely away from the capital when it came to constructions. It's true, though, that Severus was as generous to his birthplace as to the capital. He had been born in Leptis Magna on the Libyan coast of North Africa. It was a middling city during the 2nd century, but Severus hoped his favor would make it into one of the empire's showpieces. In 205, the empire and his family took a little vacation to Leptis Magna. Perhaps the aging Severus was feeling nostalgic, and he wanted to show his pampered sons his relatively rustic upbringing. When the imperial ship arrived, they disembarked onto the docks, which were under construction. Severus had ordered them upgraded. The need for these upgrades was because the harbor of the city kept silting up and needed to be dredged frequently. Ironically, Severus's improvements actually made the silting problem worse. Just like his repairs at the statue of Memnon in Egypt, his attempt at restoration only made the object of repair worse. Perhaps his entire emperorship is the same: attempts at restoration that caused bigger problems down the road. Anyway, the imperial family would have seen construction wherever they went in Leptis Magna, thanks to the generosity of the emperor. In the town's center, laborers were at work building a new forum, an arch honoring Severus, and a basilica. Though these basilicas will be adopted by the Christians in later centuries, until Constantine at least, the basilica was a large public building, usually built beside a forum, that was used for court and other official functions. Returning to Rome, we will let the gout-riddled emperor sit in peace for a while. While he rests, his family and subordinates are busy and active. Some feuding with their brothers, some ruling the empire, some creating a cultural salon, and others crafting the law code, which still is the DNA of our legal system today. Part 2. Legally Dawned. In most discussions of Septimius Severus, his militarization of the empire is usually the focus. This certainly impacted the fate of the next couple of centuries. His pay raises and reforms put the military front and center of imperial policy and finances. Underappreciated, and somewhat paradoxically, the legal developments of his reign may be his most lasting contribution to history. This was the golden age of Roman jurisprudence. Even as the power of the princeps expanded, the legal framework, which he could work within or work without, solidified. Let me pause for a moment and warn you that law is far from a strong point of mine. If you've received any higher-level legal training, I'm sure you'll be shaking your head about some of what I'm about to cover. For the rest of us, hopefully what follows will scratch the surface of the important legal figures of the early 3rd century and go beyond the broad statements about their influence. I've tried to dig a little bit deeper than what's found in most of the top online sources and go into why these figures were important, why their work stands above that of jurists in other times. Since the time of Augustus, the emperor had the power to adjudicate cases. That power expanded from its original limited scope to, by the 2nd century, the emperor having jurisdiction in both criminal and civil cases. He could now act as a judge of first instance, meaning a case would be brought directly to him, or he could act as an appeals judge when decisions of lower courts were challenged. This great legal power came with great legal responsibility for the princeps, mainly in a large number of cases brought before the emperor. From the middle of the 2nd century, emperors began employing jurists in their council who could make legal rulings and set legal precedents, without the emperor personally needing to intervene. 3 jurists from the Severan period made a lasting impact on the history of legal theory. Court decisions and law in general was a nebulous thing at this point in Roman history. As far as I can tell, there wasn't one place someone could go to read all the law and check all of the decisions made in court cases at this time. Hang with me here. We're about to skip ahead a few centuries. In the year 529, when Justinian became the Roman emperor in Constantinople, he set about to systematize and simplify Roman law. The result of this effort was the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, which included the Codex, an encyclopedia of imperial enactments since Hadrian's time, the Digest, briefs of court cases and legal opinions drawn from legal scholars of past centuries, the Institutions, a textbook on law for new law students, and the Novellae, new laws passed during and after Justinian's time. This work became law for the Eastern Roman Empire for the next millennia, and while lost in the West for several centuries, by the High Middle Ages it was refound and had become standard for legal education at institutes of learning in Europe such as the University of Bologna. From here, it influenced nearly all European law until the modern period, when Napoleon instituted his Napoleonic Code, which made the Code of Justinian its backbone. Okay, background aside, let's get back to the 3rd century. The first and most influential of the 3 jurists was Papinian. Many have claimed him to be the preeminent jurist of Roman history. Papinian served as Praetorian prefect for Septimius Severus following the execution of the previous prefect, Claudianus. We'll talk all about him in the next section. Papinian seems to have been from Emesa in Roman Syria, and perhaps was a relative of the Augusta, Severus's wife, Julia Domna. More of Papinian's work has been lost than that of the next 2 jurists, but several treatises are extant. A work titled Questions is about complex legal problems and the interpretation of statutes. Another, titled Responses, examines a selection of legal cases which are particularly useful examples of legal principle that Papinian wanted to highlight. He also wrote Definitions, a book spelling out clear legal definitions of many terms. Lastly, he published a work on the legal ramifications of adultery and a guide for the municipal governance of towns. Across his works, Papinian teaches with the use of legal theory. He investigates concrete cases, but applies consistent key concepts to each decision. Papinian emphasized the principle over the particular. Second of the great jurists was Ulpian. He was from Tyre, also in Roman Syria. Ulpian was a counselor of Severus, but was most active after the emperor's death. He wrote extensively and covered legal categories including freedmen, slaves, Latins, dowries, adoptions, guardianships, curators, unmarried men, inheritance, penalties of the Lex Julia, lapsed legacies, acquisition of property, wills, appointment of heirs, the breaking of wills, trusts, estates, and granting of possession. 2 quotes from Ulpian will give you a sense of his philosophy. The basic principles of law are to live honorably, not to harm any other person, to render to each his own. And a decision given by the emperor has the force of a statute. Last of the three great Severan jurists was Paulus, sometimes just called Paul. He was of Greek descent, but probably from a coastal town in Roman Syria. It's noteworthy that all three of these legal giants came from the same province, Roman Syria. Paulus was a prolific writer, writing extensively about Roman civil law. He wrote over 300 books. His two most influential works are 3 books of imperial judgments and 6 books of imperial decisions made in judicial proceedings. There appears to be some overlap between the two publications. Like maybe the 6 books was an expansion and republication of the earlier work. In both, Paulus makes Severus out to be a just and benevolent ruler. Since imperial judicial decisions had force of law, either Paul or Severus himself wanted this to be published for the benefit of the general legal public, so these imperial decisions could be cited or applied in other procedures in the lower courts. Okay, with those 3 jurists introduced, let's connect the dots. These 3 jurists are important for their influence over Justinian's systemization of Roman law. They form the bedrock of the Justinianic Code. Papinian, Ulpian, and Paulus join 2 other jurists, Gaius and Modestinus, in Justinian's Digest. Ulpian forms the largest part, with almost 1/3 of the cases coming from him. Next in proportion is Paulus, and Papinian comes next. Although Papinian had less material included, his impact is also felt through the influence he had over Ulpian and Paulus. In theory, the legal powers of the emperor were unlimited. In practice, it benefited the emperor's reputation to work within the existing law. A good emperor was expected to practice restraint. Unfortunately for the jurists, the successors of Severus did not show restraint toward them. Papinian will be executed by Caracalla. Ulpian and Paulus will be exiled by his successor, Elagabalus. Now, let's turn away from the dusty law libraries and talk about the soap opera that was the family of Severus. Part 3. Meet the Severans. You've already met the main characters of this family drama. Plautianus was yet another Praetorian prefect who took running the empire too far. Caracalla was the eldest son who hated his more charismatic brother, Geta. Julia Domna was the cultured and scandalous wife of Severus, known for her championing of artists of all kinds. Behind it all, the shadow of the aging Septimius Severus loomed. With our cast introduced, let's begin with the Praetorian prefect. Gaius Fulvius Plautianus was born in Roman Africa. He was probably a relative of Severus and certainly a friend of his. We don't need a full backstory here, but Plautianus was a capable ally of Severus. The emperor appointed him as Praetorian prefect in 197 to administer while Severus campaigned against the Parthians. Eventually, as we've just covered, Severus returned to Rome. It was time to stop campaigning and rule. But actually ruling, actually fulfilling the duties of the princeps was exhausting work. Much less appealing than it had looked back in 192 from his base on the Danube. To manage his great pile of responsibilities, Severus delegated. For court cases and legal issues, he had appointed jurists. In the provinces, he gave governors more authority to handle local issues and to rigorously collect tax. Military commands gained more authority as well, coinciding with his pay raises for soldiers and allowing legionaries to marry while serving. As for administering at the highest level, he turned over much of his duties to Plautianus. In this series, we've seen this archetype several times already. An exhausted or disinterested emperor and a praetorian prefect who actually runs the show. Think Emperor Tiberius and Sejanus, or think about Emperor Commodus and his series of prefects. It never ends well. The praetorian prefect becomes power-hungry and makes too many enemies. Plautianus had plenty. One of these was Julia Domna, the emperor's wife. With her own influence waning, she felt Plautianus had too much influence over her husband and worked to pry him out of his position. In return, Plautianus began a whisper campaign about Julia's secret escapades and infidelity. Their conflict simmered below public niceties. Also in the I Hate Plautianus club was Caracalla. The reason was the same as his mother, but his hatred slowly fermented. The year 203 saw Plautianus at the peak of his power. He shared the consulship with Severus' second son, Geta. That same year, Caracalla, who was just 14 years old, was married to Fulvia Plautilla, the daughter of Plautianus. It was not a happy marriage. Caracalla hated Fulvia, though we aren't sure why. Whatever the reason, this insult was added to the slowly dawning realization that Plautianus was stepping on Caracalla's metaphorical feet. Rumors began to swirl that Plautianus was angling to have himself named the successor to Severus, and it wasn't implausible. Plautianus now had a resume of successful governance. He was related to the imperial family, and Caracalla had a growing reputation for cruelty and debauchery. Whether or not this was only a rumor, it created its own reality. Incensed, Caracalla promised to murder Plautianus and his wife Plautilla as soon as he became emperor. Plautianus, already detesting Caracalla for his disrespect of his daughter, began to openly meddle in the emperor's son's affairs. By 205, the feud between Caracalla and the praetorian prefect had come to a boiling point. Each one hated the other. Sources disagree on what happened next. Herodian blames Plautianus for treason. Cassius Dio says Caracalla framed the prefect. Either way, Severus was informed by his son that Plautianus was plotting to kill them both. Severus had his doubts, but he summoned his relative to appear before him. Plautianus rushed to the palace. Herodian's version of the story says Plautianus put on his breastplate and ran because he was told that his accomplice had succeeded in killing the emperor. But it was a trap. Plautianus was saluted as emperor by an ally of the emperor and then brought into a room, supposedly to see the body. Severus, with his guard, was waiting for Plautianus. When confronted, the prefect denied all accusations. It was all a misunderstanding. But while he was being restrained, his breastplate was discovered. It was clear he had plans for violence. Caracalla ordered his men to kill the praetorian. This they did, without delay. In contrast, Dio's version says it was all a plot of Caracalla to clear Plautianus out of his path. He and his associates framed the prefect and presented false evidence to the emperor, which Severus believed. The end result was the same. Plautianus was summoned, he was accused of treachery, and he was executed right then and there. Perhaps this account shows Cassius Dio's feelings about Caracalla. Living through his entire reign, he was ready to believe the young Caesar had plotted Plautianus' death. The family of Plautianus, including Caracalla's wife, Plautilla, were exiled to Sicily. There they languished in obscurity, hoping the young Caesar would forget about them. But Caracalla held on to his grudges. Nearly as soon as he became emperor, in 212, he had their whole family strangled. Julia Domna didn't condone the killing of Plautianus under her son's orders, but she didn't mind seeing the prefect go. He did have too much power. Julia had cultivated her own kind of influence over her husband and over the empire itself. Of course, first and foremost, she was expected to fulfill the traditional role of the Augusta. She presented herself as a virtuous role model for wives and mothers. She likely made the wife of Augustus, Livia, her guide. Julia helped restore a meeting place called the Matronae, a building dedicated to married upper-class women. And she actively participated with the Vestal Virgins in their ceremonies. In fact, she was given the title Mater Vesta. She fulfilled her role admirably in all of this. Many of the coins from the reign of Severus feature her image on one side and the goddess Isis, or images representing motherhood, family, or harmony. On the surface, she was the ideal Augusta. Julia Domna went beyond these traditional expectations, though, and cultivated a sort of cultural salon under her patronage. She acquainted herself with the leading artists and philosophers of her time. Apollonius of Athens, Diogenes Laertius, Heraclides of Lycia, Aelian, the now elderly Galen, Antipater of Hierapolis, and Philostratus. Several of her female relatives and friends were active in this circle as well. Julia Moessa, Julia Sommeius, Mamea, and Aurea. These are the figures we know about, but Philostratus, who gives us most of our information on this part of Julia's life, implies she had many more famous contacts. Their names just haven't reached us. This Philostratus was probably the highest profile member of her circle. He was a sophist, a subscriber and reviver of the classic Greek school of rhetoric and oratory. You may have heard the term sophistry used in a negative connotation. That's because Socrates and many others criticized this skill of speech for its ability to make weaker arguments appear to be the stronger, and for the practice of sophists being hired out to make arguments. They spoke for cash, not truth. If a negative view of sophistry spread in Athens of the 4th and 5th century BC, by our period, the sophists had rehabilitated their image. Their oratorical skills were too useful to ignore. Philostratus tells us much of what we know about the later sophists in his work Lives of the Sophists. This was completed in the 230s. In it, he mentions Julia as a philosopher. Their relationship led Julia to encourage Philostratus to begin writing The Life of Apollonius of Tyana. This work is in fact the most important fruit of Julia's cultural program. This Apollonius was a philosopher from the Pythagorean school who lived in the middle of the 1st century. He traveled widely, gained disciples, performed miracles, was killed by the authorities, and allegedly ascended into heaven. If this description sounds a lot like another 1st century itinerant preacher, the parallels are either intentional or at least intentionally emphasized. The Life of Apollonius of Tyana is neither a novel nor a history. It's written as a gospel. As Christianity grows over the next century and a half, the later pagans will point to the example of Apollonius as a foil to Jesus. We don't need to get bogged down on the similarities and differences here, but we will probably discuss Apollonius again when we reach Diocletian and his persecutions. For now, just know that Philostratus' work is our main source on Apollonius, and Julia Domna's support was essential in its completion. As with almost every other Augusta, there are rumors of Julia's infidelity, just outside the notice of her husband. Her association with all of these cultural figures surely raised a few eyebrows. Our best source, Cassius Dio, doesn't make any open accusations, but he does hint at her infidelity once. As expected, the Historia Augusta comes out and says it. He, Severus, retained his wife Julia, even though she was notorious for her adulteries. Our sources are silent on Severus's own faithfulness, or lack thereof, but we shouldn't automatically assume he was particularly chaste. Both parents must have imparted a lack of virtue to their sons. By the time they were young adults, Geta and Caracalla had garnered a reputation for debauchery and cruelty. Separated by just a year, the two imperial sons were trouble to Rome and to each other. And the death of Plautianus made their behavior worse. They no longer had to fear being replaced by a more upstanding relative. Dio says, "They now went to all lengths in their conduct. They outraged women and abused boys. They embezzled money and made gladiators and charioteers their boon companions, emulating each other in the similarity of their deeds, but full of strife in their rivalries. For if the one attached himself to a certain faction, the other would be sure to choose the opposite side." They fought good morals, and they fought each other. They became a terror to the city. We hear that their feuding grew to the point of violence. In one incident, they got into a nasty competition wherein they raced each other in chariots. In the jostling, Caracalla fell to the ground and broke his leg. Severe illness followed. Severus was able to look past much of their feuding, but maybe Caracalla's illness after breaking his leg shook him to his senses. He couldn't afford to lose an heir due to some immature fighting. He needed something that would end their conflict and give them some camaraderie. A change of scenery was needed. Part 4. Family Vacation. Waking up from his administration-induced slumber, Severus looked around and found his sons fallen into depravity and squabbling, and his soldiers, the foundation of his power, growing soft in inactivity. He needed something to end his son's strife and reinvigorate the legions. Besides, he was growing old. One last time, he wanted to get back out there in the field. He looked around his empire for an opportunity. Where should they go on campaign? Britannia beckoned. A letter had reached his desk from the governor there, begging either for reinforcements or for the emperor himself to help. The Romans were suffering from large raids by the Caledonians who lived to the north of Hadrian's Wall. The wall itself still stood, but it was undermanned. The whole island was undermanned. Remember back to last decade. The final Roman governor standing in the way of Severus controlling the entire empire was Clodius Albinus. This governor of Britain had taken his 3 legions off of the island, marched them to Lugdunum in Gaul, and was soundly defeated in a huge battle against Severus. The losses among the British legions and auxiliaries was heavy. Severus had sent the remnants back to defend Britannia, but there were fewer soldiers available. The Caledonians took notice of both their temporary absences and their diminished return. In the following years, the Caledonians launched large and devastating raids south into the heart of Britain. On top of worse Roman defenses, it appears the Caledonians were cooperating more with each other, leading to bigger raids. This is a mere development of what was happening to the Germans to the north of the Rhine and Danube rivers. It seems this was a common reaction to dealing with the Romans, increased cooperation. The governor who succeeded Albinus, Verus Lupus, was forced to buy a temporary peace from a Caledonian confederation called the Maetai. The incursions stopped for a little while, but paying off raiders often just whets their appetite for more. The devastating raids soon resumed. Britain needed help. So, in the spring of 208, the imperial family set out from Rome. Septimius would never return to the capital alive. He, of course, already knew this, thanks to his reading of his fate in the stars. We get no details of their journey from Rome to the island except for an old Christian tradition that he persecuted the Christians in Lugdunum as he passed through. Afflicted by gout, Severus was usually unable to ride a horse. He traveled most of the way carried on a litter. On the island, the main body of the expedition went north to Eboracum, modern York. Over the autumn and winter of late 208 and early 209, Severus gathered soldiers and engaged in engineering to facilitate his movements. He brought up to 40,000 soldiers for the upcoming campaign. His engineers were busy draining marshes and building bridges. Coins from late 208 show this, with either a bridge or the word trajectus, meaning to cross over or bridge a stream in Latin. Hadrian's Wall was repaired and improved. It seems that the western section, which had been turf only, was rebuilt into a stone wall to match the eastern sections. With the coming of spring in 209, Severus and Caracalla, Geta was left behind in Eboracum to manage justice and politics on the island, set out from the wall into the Intervellum, the land between Hadrian's Wall and the Antonine Wall. The Caledonians weren't oblivious to what was happening to their south. They sent envoys seeking peace. Severus put on a good face and pretended to entertain their offers, but really he was just buying time for his preparations to be completed. Severus intended to finish the work of Agricola more than 100 years before and to conquer the rest of the island. Its length is 951 miles. Its greatest breadth, 308, and its least, 40. Of all this territory, we hold a little less than one half. Severus, accordingly, desiring to subjugate the whole of it, invaded Caledonia. The first step was to reoccupy the land between the two walls. This the Romans did without much trouble. The most fearsome natives, whom Cassius Dio splits into the Maetai and the Caledonians, lived farther north. Once the Intervellum was pacified, work began to repair the Antonine Wall. For the first time in decades, this wall too was manned and defended. Next came the real challenge, expanding control farther north. Venturing out into the true wilderness, Severus set his army to follow the route Agricola had taken in the 80s. At first, nature was the main obstacle. Forests, marshes, and rivers slowed his advance. They encountered no direct resistance from the natives. Cassius Dio states that they were being lured along. But the Caledonians and Maetai weren't absent. Whenever a foraging party departed from the main baggage train, they were hunted down or ambushed. The natives began to employ guerrilla tactics with devastating success. The Romans suffered heavy casualties and were unable to bring the natives out to fight in a true open field battle. Progress now slowed. The army was constantly picked off in open terrain. In response, they made use of the abandoned Roman camps left behind during Agricola's campaign. Each of these was repaired and fortified. These became bases for controlling the country. Our exact chronology of the invasion of Caledonia is unclear. It seems from here the Romans slowly made progress north, hopping from fort to fort over the course of 209. They sent out regular raids from these forts and ravaged the countryside. This tactic found success. Some of the tribes surrendered to the Romans, and by the end of 209, despite heavier than expected losses, it appeared the Romans were on the verge of conquering all of Caledonia. Over that winter, either from a fort in modern Scotland or after retreating back to the relative comfort of Eboracum, Septimius Severus declared victory. In premature celebration, he gave Caracalla and Geta both the title Britannicus, and himself the title Britannicus Maximus. If he thought the war was won, his astrologers and his generals had failed him. Next decade, the just conquered Caledonia will spring into revolt. Septimius Severus will pass on from this world, and we will see the feud of Caracalla and Geta shift from palace squabbling to determining the fate of the whole empire. Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate this podcast and subscribe. I'll see you next time.